What would you do if your home had no central heating, the temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and you had only a bag of corn husks? In the Great Depression, families used tricks so shocking they'd be banned today. Here are some strange ways they fought the cold. Last one will stun you. Chapter 1. They burned corn cobs like they were gold. Forget cozy fireplaces and endless logs. In the winter of the 1930s, heat could come from something you'd normally toss to the pigs: the stripped, pale cores of corn. When the Dust Bowl ripped through the Midwest, trees were scarce, coal was expensive, and every penny was rationed. In 1933, a ton of coal in rural Kansas could cost $6, about $140 in today's money, and many families simply couldn't pay. Corn cobs, on the other hand, were free. After the kernels were shelled for livestock feed, the cobs were swept into barrels or dumped in burlap sacks, stored in sheds until the cold set in. They burned quick and hot, like paper crammed into a stove, which meant someone, often a kid, had to keep feeding the fire every 20 to 30 minutes. Cob duty wasn't optional. It was survival. In Iowa, children lugged buckets of cobs from the shed before dawn, their hands raw from the cold. The smoke was harsh, leaving chimneys slick with tar-like soot, but it kept frost off the windows. A 1934 WPA winter survey found 18% of rural Nebraska households listed corn cobs as their primary heat source. People got creative. Some mixed dried cow or horse manure with cobs for a slower burn. Others used cob ash for scrubbing pots or spreading on icy steps. In Oklahoma, one farmer bragged to a reporter that his family survived an entire winter on nothing but God's gift to a hungry stove: the humble cob. It wasn't romantic. It was dirty, smelly, and exhausting. But in a winter where the choice was burn cobs or freeze, those knobby little leftovers were as precious as coal. Chapter 2. Sleeping inside a newspaper because your blanket was on the pig. Winters in the 1930s were brutal, especially in the Midwest and rural South. Without central heating, indoor nighttime temperatures could drop to 20 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. For many, a good blanket was worth more than jewelry. If you didn't have enough, you improvised. And sometimes that meant sleeping inside yesterday's newspaper. It wasn't just an old wives' tale. Layers of newsprint trapped air, creating insulation. Hobos called it readin' and sleepin', wrapping themselves like burritos in the classifieds. Families in unheated homes lined mattresses with pages from the Sears Roebuck catalog, laid more sheets over their children, and topped it with whatever fabric they had: old coats, curtains, even horse blankets. In 1931, a Chicago charity distributed over 500 pounds of old newspapers specifically as bedding for jobless men. Why not just use regular blankets? Because they were expensive. A decent wool blanket cost $3 in 1932, about $70 today. Families often had only one or two. And in rural areas, those blankets might be keeping livestock warm instead. Farmers sometimes draped their best wool over calves or pigs in freezing barns, knowing that losing an animal could mean losing a year's income. One Nebraska farmer's daughter later recalled, "Our blanket was on the sow that had piglets. Daddy said we could shiver, but she couldn't." Other tricks. People slept in their day clothes, wore socks over mittens, and huddled together in one bed for shared body heat. A practice so common it earned the nickname Three Dog Night, and yes, sometimes it literally involved the family dogs. It wasn't romantic. It was survival, layered in ink and desperation, and it worked most nights. Chapter 3. Slipping a hot brick into bed and hoping you didn't catch fire. Before electric blankets, before microwavable heat packs, people turned to whatever could hold heat long enough to last the night. In the 1930s, that meant bricks, river stones, flat irons, or even soapstones, heated in a wood or coal stove until almost glowing. The idea was simple. Wrap the heated object in layers of cloth or old socks, tuck it under the covers near your feet, and let it radiate warmth. But if you wrapped it poorly, or it shifted during the night, you'd wake up with serious burns. Hospital records from the winter of 1934 in rural Minnesota show multiple cases of heat stone burns, often on shins or toes. Soapstone could retain heat for up to 4 hours, longer than brick, making it the Cadillac of bed warmers. Railroad workers, traveling salesmen, and even children heading to unheated schools carried heated bricks in baskets or tin pails as portable warmers. In North Dakota, some families placed 2 hot bricks inside a hollowed-out wooden box at the foot of the bed, nicknamed the poor man's foot stove. For those who couldn't afford coal, it was a survival hack. A single brick heated in the oven used just a fraction of the fuel needed to warm the whole room. The downside? Bricks occasionally cracked from sudden temperature changes, scattering shards of hot material through the bed. And yet, year after year, families risked burns and broken toes for that precious warmth. Chapter 4. Whole families slept in one bed. And sometimes weren't related. Forget the romanticized Little House on the Prairie version. This was pure necessity. One room, one bed, multiple bodies. In the depths of winter, heating an entire house was impossible for many Depression-era families, so they heated the people instead. It was common for 3, 4, or even 6 people to pile into a single bed. Children slept sideways at the foot, adults at the top. Boarders, neighbors, or distant cousins often joined in, not for friendship, but because body heat could mean the difference between life and death. In mining towns, transient workers rented sleeping space in beds already shared by others. This gave rise to hot bedding, where one person slept while the other worked a shift, then swapped places, literally sliding into the other's still warm spot. A 1932 housing survey in Chicago found that in the poorest districts, 41% of households had more than 2 people per bed in winter. Of course, this closeness came with gossip. Sleeping arrangements sometimes caused tensions, jealous spouses, whispering neighbors, and occasional scandals. But most families didn't care. As one Iowa farmer put it, "A little awkward is better than dead." Chapter 5. They plugged drafts with cow manure and pretended it was fine. Houses in the 1930s, especially in rural America, were drafty nightmares. Gaps in floorboards, cracks in walls, and poorly fitted windows let in icy winds. With no money for proper insulation, people turned to whatever they had, including frozen cow manure. The technique was shockingly common. Pack wet manure into gaps where it would freeze solid and block wind. The smell? Noticeable, but tolerable when weighed against frostbite. In fact, once frozen, the odor was minimal, until spring thaw, when cleanup was memorable. Other ceiling materials included tar paper, burlap sacks stuffed with straw, old quilts, and even catalog pages glued over cracks with flour paste. Some farmers mixed mud and horsehair to make a kind of Depression stucco for their barns and homes. In 1936, the USDA's Farm Security Administration recommended manure insulation in an official winter prep bulletin for farm families. People joked about it, but in reality, it saved lives. In temperatures that could plunge below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 28 degrees Celsius, a little stink was a small price for survival. Chapter 6. Dinner was also your heater. In the 1930s, a pot on the stove wasn't just a meal. It was central heating. When you couldn't afford coal or wood for a roaring fire, the trick was to cook slow all day. A big kettle of beans, stew, or cornmeal mush would bubble on the back of the stove for 8 to 10 hours, throwing heat into the room. A pot of beans could raise the kitchen temperature by 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to take the edge off in a one-room shack. In smaller homes, people gathered in the kitchen, not just to help with cooking, but because it was the only warm space. Families often used cast iron Dutch ovens, which held heat long after the fire went out. The USDA noted in a 1934 bulletin that a 12-pound iron pot retains usable heat for nearly 2 hours after removal from the flame. People exploited that, pulling the pot off the stove and setting it in the middle of the room like a makeshift radiator. Railroad camps and lumber crews took it further, placing huge 30-gallon kettles over outdoor fires, then moving them into bunkhouses at night for warmth. In rural Kentucky, people would leave the oven door open after baking bread, letting the escaping heat warm the toes. It wasn't waste, it was strategy. But there was a downside. Fuel shortages meant you might choose between cooking food or heating the house. Some families boiled cabbage or potatoes in the same water they'd later use for washing dishes, because every drop of hot water mattered. Chapter 7. The government paid men to chop firewood, and people fought for the job. In 1935, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, launched a massive relief program to provide free firewood for the poor. Across the U.S., crews cut more than 250,000 cords of wood that winter. To put that in perspective, one cord could keep a small home warm for 6 to 8 weeks. For the poorest families, this wood wasn't charity, it was survival currency. WPA pay was $41.57 a month, barely enough to live on. But the wood was free for those on relief lists. This created chaotic lines at distribution yards. In Duluth, Minnesota, fights broke out when wood deliveries ran short. Newspapers reported axe-swinging brawls between desperate men. Some people found creative ways to sneak extra loads, offering bribes to truck drivers or following wagons home. In rural Michigan, kids were sent to tail WPA workers and pick up chips and scraps along the roadside. In the winter of 1937, WPA wood yards in Wisconsin had to hire guards because thieves were stealing entire wagon loads overnight. The program not only kept families warm, but gave unemployed men dignity. As one WPA foreman said, "We don't just hand them heat, we let them make it." Chapter 8. They wore the same underwear. All winter, and it could stand on its own, wool underwear was the winter armor of the 1930s. It was warm, durable, and rarely washed. Laundry in sub-zero weather meant hauling and heating water, then hanging clothes outside to freeze solid before they could dry. Most people simply wore the same underclothes for weeks or even months. By February, they'd be so stiff with sweat, dirt, and body oils they could stand on their own when taken off. A phrase found in more than one 1930s memoir. A 1938 health survey in rural Iowa found that 27% of farm families washed their winter undergarments only twice a season. The rest relied on airing them out near the stove to freshen them. Some people sewed patches onto the inside of their long johns rather than take them off to mend. In mining camps and logging camps, underwear was practically communal property. Men who arrived without any would be given loaners from the company dry room, already broken in by someone else. It wasn't about hygiene. It was about heat retention. Every layer of dirt, every patch of grease, made the fabric just a little more windproof. As grim as it sounds, some swore they were warmer in February than in December because their underwear had seasoned. If you thought these winter survival tricks were wild, you haven't heard the half of it. So hit like, subscribe, and watch my next video for even stranger Depression-era secrets you won't believe.